most investors will disqualify and carry on doing what they're doing. I said earlier that 17% of investors are at the limits, and 83% are well inside those limits. So I think they will just carry on, but there's definitely going to be a continued fascination and engagement with the market over new builds, because not only have there been tax benefits of new builds in the past, which are fading away at the moment, but under national that's not such an advantage, but under these DTI rules, new builds are definitely going to be where the market's excited, guys.
Welcome back, Leverage Addicts, your go-to podcast for all things property and finance strategies. I'm your host, Blandon, and today is an episode you guys don't want to miss because we have Matthew Gilligan on again. For our first-time listeners, Matt is a renowned property investor and the head of Gilligan, Rowe and Associates. Now, just a personal story, I've consulted several firms around property tax advice, especially when I was trying to structure JV deals with family and friends for development. And I've got to say, GRA gave me the most comprehensive advice and most confidence with what they propose. In that phase, I probably spent in the tens of thousands because I was like, I'm worried. I own a business and I'm getting into this stuff where things get mixed up, and GRA really put me at ease with the proposal. So definitely when it comes to property tax advice, there's no one else I would recommend. Today, we're going to get Matt's take on how debt to income ratio might impact your property investing and explore the opportunity and threats for property investors as well. Matt, it's fantastic to have you back on again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Before we dive in, listeners, if you find value in today's episode, please share it with somebody that could benefit from it. That's all we ask for, because you are going to be able to help us grow the community and get better advice around your property journey. So let's talk about this hot topic here. Every property investor's mind is that, hey, debt to income ratio is coming in. Lots of fear that these regulations going to stop them from scaling their property portfolio and might lower the demand and impact on property values as well. So Matt, let's start with the basics. Perhaps you can explain briefly what debt to income ratio is and why is it causing such a stir in the property community?
Thanks, Blandon. Well, firstly, thanks for having me here to chat to your listeners. I'm Matthew Gilligan, Chartered Accountant in Auckland. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a Chartered Accountant and I specialise in tax and legal structures. And I'm also an investor, as Blandon said, so I borrow a lot of money, and GRA is a medium-sized accounting practice, so we pay attention to the property market and everything that affects property because our clients are always interested in these topics. So for that reason, I've been blogging a bit about DTIs and following them because it has the prospect of severely affecting our client base and also myself. And initially, Blandon, I was pretty anxious about them. I was quite angry about them. I thought, more nanny state interference, another Triple CFA debacle. And I regularly interview David Seymour and National Party people who we connect with, and we fund them and we lobby them on behalf of the industry. So they come and talk to us because we lobby them. And so we're pretty connected to those organisations. And I was furious. I thought, off the back of Triple CFA, this is unnecessary nanny state interference. And indeed, you look at the volatility in the property market. Where's it coming from? It's coming from Adrian Orr. It's coming from the Reserve Bank. That guy pumped massive amounts of liquidity into the economy and dropped interest rates so low and created a housing boom. And a 5-year-old worked out what was going to happen. Every 5-year-old in the country and their dads and their mums, and bought houses and speculated.
Yeah.
And the smart ones dumped their housing in 2020 and 2021, which I did. I sold all my less favourable assets and cashed out. But unfortunately, the old school who've been around for a while who did that left in the market the newbies who didn't see it as a housing bubble being built by an imprudent Reserve Bank governor holding hands with the then Labor government, making themselves popular, which is what it was. Unfortunately, a bunch of people bought at that peak in 2021 on slim deposits, anticipating that a low interest rate environment would continue. They didn't think about inflation or change of government or the hangover that comes from such a credit-fueled party and the housing boom that follows. And so now what we're seeing is the hangover from that. It's directly on Adrian Orr. I mean, this is his inflationary mistake that he's fixing. And what we're seeing, of course, is high interest rates to quell inflation. It'll pass, and we're in the middle of a crash. House prices are down 20%. We might have another bad year next year in 2025. I think immigration settings are being reversed to push people out. So we're going to have softening demand for rentals, and we're going to have, if we believe the Reserve Bank governor, he's going to keep rates high until inflation eases even further. So right on top of that, we've got DTIs coming in, and you'd have to say, do we need these right now on top of a housing market that's really a lot of pressure on it?
Yeah.
And you can say that actually DTIs will be good and bad, that there's a story to support them and a story to say we shouldn't be doing this right now. But let's start with what they are. Well, a debt to income ratio is simply a ratio that the bank's going to have to comply with that will limit the amount of debt to be a percentage of income. And the settings are set separately for housing and for investment property. So for home loan lending, the amount of debt that you can have can only be 6 times the amount of income you've got. Whereas for investment lending, you can have 7 times debt to income as a ratio. So to borrow $700,000 for investment property, you would need to earn $100,000. To borrow $600,000 for a family home, you would need to earn $100,000 on a ratio of 6 to 1, 7 to 1. Those are the ratios they're bringing in. So that means that you're going to have people who currently qualify for home loans that will not qualify because their income is not 1/6 or 1/7 their proposed debt for investment property or for home lending. The rules do allow for 20% of the banking system to not comply with these rules, so that the banks can still lend money outside of these ratios. And they are allowing for an easing of loan-to-value ratios. For example, for investors, you can now borrow 70% instead of 65% previously. So all of that sounds constrictive. Previously, the banks got to set what income to debt ratio that they would tolerate under prudential lending controls. Now that you've got a centralised mechanism set by the Reserve Bank that controls the amount of debt that can be issued by banks as a ratio of income. But that's, central government control, which I don't welcome. I don't like it. I don't think it's necessary either. Because if you look at the New Zealand banking environment, we've got a housing crash. By definition, property bubble is a reduction of value of more than 20% if you Wikipedia it. And we've had New Zealand's housing values come off 20% in the last 2 years. And that's the first time I've seen it in my career. I've never seen a housing bubble. And the extraordinary thing, Blandon, is that the bubble was built by Adrian Orr. It's his bubble. He did it. He'll say it was COVID. He had no choice. That's bullshit. And I was talking to the Opus boys the other day, and they said, well, Matthew, what else could you do? Because if you didn't drop the interest rates, New Zealand would have gone broke. And we need to track to our partners, our trading partners, or our exchange rate would move. And I really was annoyed because I should have said to Ed McKnight, I should have said to him, what Orr should have done is he should have dropped the interest rate so that our exchange rate stayed parallel, but he should have dropped LVRs because he maintained so much liquidity in the banking system that he just created a speculator out of every household. They're all sitting at home doing nothing. They all went mad. So if he had said, well, okay, we're going to have a LVR of 50% for investors and 80% for homeowners.
Yeah,
you could have had your cake and eaten it. You could have softened the cost of living with low interest rates. You could have kept our exchange rate paired, and you could have reduced liquidity.
That would have been interesting if LVR for investors went up and the interest rate was more favorable for your first home buyers.
Well, I mean, you could have kept interest rates low for everybody, but just reduced liquidity, which brings me to debt to income ratios. I think that will be the best part of them. If you look at what this Reserve Bank governor faces and we have as an environment, we have a high cost of living in mid-2024 where we are now. And if we drop interest rates, you'll create house speculation and you'll start to build another housing boom and you'll cause inflationary pressure. And so DTIs, the best thing about them is the government or the Reserve Bank will be able to drop interest rates aggressively and dial down the DTI. It's another tool. They can bring back LVRs, but they'll be able to dial down the DTIs to constrict the amount of lending and keep it on a proportionate ratio. So if interest rates are at 7.5 and you drop to 5, you might drop the DTI down by 20% or something like that to
Yeah.
stop another housing bubble building. I think that would be a very good thing for DTIs. Every other thing about them, I detest and don't think we need it. Like, it's nanny state central government intervention, but I do acknowledge that it is going to help interest rates come down sooner. The other thing is, why do they want these? They want these rules so that they've got more tools in the toolkit to control the economy and to control inflation. And you can't argue with that, that is there. Ironically, the housing bubble that just popped, caused by Adrian Orr, would have been controlled by these rules if they were in. They would have safeguarded us against Adrian Orr's mistake, ironically.
Yes.
Let's talk exemptions because, we've talked about the reason why they're coming in. It's to give macroprudential controls to the Reserve Bank. We've talked about what they are, 6-1 and 7-1, but let's talk about the exemptions because the exemptions are very generous. Loans that will be exempt DTIs will be all existing lending, all of your old lending or existing lending. So all of my debt, all of your debt, Blandon, doesn't have to comply with DTIs until you try and draw new debt on top of it.
Right.
Construction loans for development, exempt. Loans for new builds, exempt. Bridging finance, exempt. Kāinga Ora first home loan scheme. Is that still here? Did they just cancel that? I think they just cancelled that, didn't they?
They took out the funding for first home buyers, getting the extra 5-10 grand.
Right, yeah. Miserable bastards. Geez, why didn't they leave that in? Business loans are exempt and commercial property loans are exempt. So I actually think that the impact of this will be relatively low because on the DTI's paper, which they released in January this year, only 17% of current lending in New Zealand as at January 2024 was at the fringes of those ratios. 83% of borrowers in New Zealand were well and truly inside. So I think they're bringing them in purposefully so they don't bite.
Yeah.
And I think that's prudent. They've provided plenty of scope to exempt debt for new build, construction loans, commercial loans. So really, they're quite a soft start. But if you start seeing house price inflation or inflation get away, they can start to use this as another tool outside of LVRs to dial things down.
Because if we look at, let's just put a real scenario in here, because we talk about 7 times on an investor. We get 100,000, we can borrow 700,000. Now, let's say if it's a 5% yield property, right? Maybe Auckland home and income. I don't even think you can get 5%, but let's just say home and income, 5%, $2 million, right? That means the house price for that particular property is $2 million. We're only getting 700,000.
Yeah, but who buys a $2 million property for an investment property?
Let's break it into two $1 million property at 5%.
$500,000 properties.
Yeah.
Rented at $600 per week. They're 80-metre 2-bedroom houses. Let's get real. That's an investor, and it's a new build, so it's exempt. So who cares?
Because okay, let's just say $1,000 a week.
Advocate for the Reserve Bank. Actually, I'm not a fan of the Reserve Bank at the moment, but devil's advocate, these rules are quite good, I think, in terms of the way they've been carefully designed to not affect stuff that we shouldn't be playing with, like new housing.
It almost make investing in, I guess, lower cash flow property super hard because you need way more capital. But if you're buying something in the regions, right, with 8% yield, you're still looking okay, I guess, at that ratio.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got gross yield and net yield. So maybe we should talk at a bit more granular level. What is income? And there hasn't been a lot of talk about what is income. And I rang 3 banks, none of them knew. And when I say rang the banks, senior management of the banks. But it's anticipated that the banks will take the rents. They may sensitise it a bit. They may take off a bit for operating expenses, or they may just take 100%. It hasn't been clarified. Plus your income. And for these rules, they're saying that they will, for the DTI rules, they'll take 100% of your bonuses and that sort of thing. So whereas under their debt servicing testing that they do internally for their internal lending practices, which are very, very conservative, the bankers I was speaking to were saying that they'll be more aggressive on their definition of income with DTIs. because the banks don't like these. They don't want DTIs. It's just more regulation. They don't need it.
Yeah.
We've had a 20% reduction of the housing market, and the biggest crash I've seen in the housing market. And, the only people that are excited about it are the keyboard warriors online that hate property investors, who are, fans, Farm Baker, whatever his name is, who just hates property investors. I don't know if you see me pelting him online, but he's guys like that think that property investors are evil and that everybody should have one house and nothing more. The system's rigged for the old school. People like that are just loving it. But everyone else is like, well, so what? House prices will be up 60, 70% in 10 years. The bank has regulated and controlled our lending ratios to income already. So when they were lending money at 3, the banks tested us at 8. And if you couldn't hack 8, they wouldn't lend to you. So these DTIs are on top of a system that's already doing that. And that's why we don't have a crash.
Yeah, if I try to think back to 2021, 2020, when I helped several clients buy 4, 5, 6 property within a short span of 12 to 18 months. And the income was something like 11 times the income. So it was quite ridiculous. And if there was some DTI in place, it would have slowed those people down. And, maybe they couldn't buy 5 or 6, but they would still buy, 3 or 4. And they were still have done really, really well. But how do you?
It's ironic though that in 2021 they were trying to buy as many as they could. I was selling.
Yeah, no, definitely.
You're supposed to be a counter-cyclical investor. You sell at the boom and you buy in the bust, and it's so obvious.
I don't think it was
it's the best time to buy.
Yeah. I don't think they were we have some prudent investors. Like when interest rate was 2.5%, we were buying 6.5% gross yield in places like Rotorua. So we're still keeping a bit of a margin in there. And the second thing is one thing that I try to that I learned from you, Matt, is to put your investments on longer term, because it's about riding the wave. So you got these clients locking in 2.8%, 3% for 5 years. They're in a rock solid place, right?
I've got 24 million locked at 2.9 for 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, there you go. There you go, audience.
There you go. I'm skiting.
I wanted to ask.
The other thing is, because Blandon and I were having a chat before we got on here. The other thing is, and Blandon was asking me, as sort of an older, more mature investor, how do you get and stay big? And the answer is, as you get bigger, you trade more and you keep your LVRs low. So, if you're going to borrow $10 million, you wouldn't want to have your LVRs above 45, in my view.
Can I get you to expand on this? Can we expand on this idea? Because this has come to my realization as well, just reviewing a lot of portfolio, because I guess a lot of investors have this mindset, right? Maybe mom and dad were able to get a several property based on the old banking rules. It was a lot easier. And they have this mindset of I don't want to sell my properties, even though the cash flow is not that good and the debt is getting more expensive. They just have this mindset of just I need to hold on to all of these things. But you're talking about, as you get bigger, you need to consider trading. Yeah. What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the rationale is there comes a point where you just get fearful. Doesn't matter how rich you are or how much cash flow you've got. When you start to hit your rational limits, you rationally start to say, well, anything more than this, and I can't handle it if interest rates go beyond X%. And interest rates do go beyond X%, as we found out. We had always, mid 2% interest rates. I was thinking we could have a war, a world event. We could have another Wall Street meltdown. We could have tradable inflation go through the roof. We have all sorts of things that could affect us. And just a hangover from too much credit around globally is going to keep inflation high. So a rational person would say, well, interest rates will go back up. So you say, well, how much debt do I want to carry in that environment? What's it going to look like? You look ahead. Now, the bank is going to do this for you. That's what these macro prudential controls are for. That's what DTIs are for. But a wise investor will look at it within their household. And so for me, as you get a bit older, you say, well, I don't want to lose a lot because I can't make it back. I don't have time. So you start to dial back your loan to value ratios. Doesn't mean to say you stop doing stuff. It means you don't carry massive amounts of debt relative to the asset value. So what do you do if you want to stay active? Well, I build stuff and I sell it. And, each time you run a cycle through, you pay a lot of tax and you pay real estate agents to sell it for you. So you give half away, but you still get to keep half and you can pay that down off debt. Or you mix a bit where you've been to my property school and heard me say this many times, you might sell 7, keep 3. So the profit you make off the 7, you drop back over the 3 that you keep. And so, 70% of the development was taxable. So you keep half of that after agents' fees and tax. And then the 30% that you're keeping, there's no GST or income tax or agents' fees on that. So you get 100% of the profit on 3 and half the profit on 70%, which you put over the 3 you kept. And because you've got rid of the bulk of the debt on the portfolio, you end up with your gearing through a cycle of that well below 50%. You'll be mid-30s, 40% if you've done it right, with a 25% GP on the development. Bit of a mouthful for newbies, but old school investors will know what I mean by when I say
There's a caveat to what Matt just said, and that is, don't try this at home unless you get the right tax structure.
Yeah, you need the right tax and legal structures, and also you need the right finance structure. So Blandon will be able to help you with split loan structures and making sure that your family home doesn't get dragged into it.
So I want to just maybe go back to, let's go back to DTI, right? Because we talked about, what it is and how it works. What do you think is going to happen to property investors that want to just keep scaling their portfolio? What are the opportunities and what do they need to look out for?
Well, new builds are exempt. Pretty much anything with a new CCC is exempt. So throw a relocatable home in your backyard. Borrowing for that, it's a new build. Move the existing property back on the yard and put one in the front. Now you've got 2 new builds.
Yeah.
Knock it all down and build 8 terraced houses with walk-up car parks at the front. It's construction exempt and it's new build, it's exempt.
So now that we have explored DTI, what it is, and briefly, how is that going to play out? What the ratio is going to look like. Matt, I wanted to ask you what you think are the potential opportunities, because like a lot of people are going to think, oh man, I'm not going to be able to build like a massive portfolio. So how are they going to maybe take this on? And what are some potential threats that people might need to watch out for?
Let's just start with the opportunities. So if we go through the exemptions, existing lending and portability of loans are still there, so you can refinance existing debt. Construction loans for new builds and new investment property are exempt. So that's, I think, going to be the biggest exemption and opportunity for investors is, take your existing house, put a relocatable in the backyard, pick the existing house up, move it back, put a relocatable in the front yard, you've got 2 new builds. So now those loans are exempt DTIs. Knock the houses down, build 10 new rental properties with walk-up parking in the front, and a very common typology. All that's exempt new builds. So construction loans and loans for new builds, fully modes. Bridging finance, Kāinga Ora first home loan schemes, they're exempt. Business loans and, of course, commercial property loans. So it's business as usual in those spaces. So I don't think that, as I said earlier, that this is going to crush the property market, but it is going to push you for your investing into categories that are exempt, if and only if your income is at the fringes of what you're able to service. Bear in mind that most investors will just qualify and carry on doing what they're doing. I said earlier that 17% of investors are at the limits, and 83% are well inside those limits. So I think they will just carry on, but there's definitely going to be a continued fascination and engagement with the market over new builds because not only have there been tax benefits of new builds in the past, which are fading away at the moment, but under national, that's not such an advantage. But under these DTI rules, new builds are definitely going to be where the market's really excited. Guys want to buy. On the risk side of this, first thing is I want to talk about capital growth. Capital growth is going to become linked to income growth. Because if there is a link between your ability to borrow and your income, then there's going to be a link between capital growth and the amount of debt that the market's got. So that linkage is going to flow through to incomes. Not a bad thing from a house price stability perspective. Incomes do grow over time, but that linkage is going to emerge, which I think will slow capital growth down, which to me makes cash flow more important. So how do you make money out of property? There are 3 ways. You've done my school. You can tell me straight away. What are the 3 ways you make money out of property, Blandon?
You can hold it.
That's capital growth. Capital growth, yeah.
You can rent it out, cash flow.
Cash flow.
And you can generate the equity by...
Exactly. Spoken like an investor. So you make your money on the way in. I'll put you on the spot.
Sorry, on the way in. Yeah, that's the one you always say.
Yeah. And I think newbie investors miss that because they buy a property and say, well, over time it'll grow in value and I'll get some cash flow as rents go up. But actually, if you're going to spend $1 million and buy 2 rental properties, you want to buy them for $800,000. And if you can't buy them for $800,000 because the market's not distressed, you want to build them for $800,000. So that's when you go and you drawing the dots between the lines here, the lines between the dots. These rules are going to allow you to do new builds, and within that you'll be able to buy, build, revalue, recycle, reinvest, the old BRRRR strategy, because new builds are exempt. So what's a new build? It's a new CCC. So
awesome.
I think there'll be plenty of scope in that. Make money when you buy. You've got to do that, or you're just missing the biggest part of the investment cycle.
So I think I guess from this rule is still in line with, I guess, what the government wanted was to have more new builds to come, make it a bit easier for people who are building houses. And if we try to maybe look at the long term, right? So you talked about, okay, the capital gains is going to be sort of grow with the debt. So do you see, like, what are your prediction with prices? Like what does that actually look like in the future?
Well, I mean, that's supply and demand.
Yeah.
So,
I'm putting you on the spot now.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and I've got a good answer. So you can't hold the tide back. So political will and socialist intent is not going to stop houses forming if population is coming here. That's household formation. Roughly every 3 people that are bred or immigrated into New Zealand form a house. And you have ebbs and flows of immigration. We're mid-2024. Actually, the immigration settings are pushing people out of the country at the moment. I don't know if you're aware. The current immigration settings in May 2024 are insane. If you've got a working visa and it comes up, my understanding is that you have to leave the country for a year and then come back to reapply to work again for a large number of the categories. And the reason why I know this is a financier is a client of mine said that he's getting 2 cars a week dumped at the airport as these workers just drive the cars that they've financed to the airport, jump on a plane and leave the keys to the car. 2 a week. And he said it's these new settings where, particularly in the low wage economy, they're not allowed to stay, so they just leave. So that's actually reducing rental demand. Every 3 people that leave, we need 1 less house. Okay, so that's at the moment. Then the government will say, oh, we need these people back. They'll change the settings. They'll start flowing back in. So immigration drives it. Net births and death rates drive it. New Zealand grows. So areas like Auckland that have young populations will continue to grow over the long term. Maybe short term there's reduced demand. In the long term, you can't hold the tide back. Those people need houses. And as the demand builds from population growth, as incomes rise through growth of income, what looks expensive and potentially difficult to invest in this environment 2-3 years' time, it all reemerges, and it's just a supply and demand thing. Developers will build when the demand is there, bearing in mind that new builds are exempt and construction loans are exempt. So I actually think that it will be business as usual. We're in the middle of a recession. We're bringing in rules that stop people that are on the fringes from borrowing. That's not a bad thing. Maybe it'll slow the recovery down. That's a bad thing. But big picture, perhaps not a bad thing.
Yeah. I want to expand on that because
I don't think it's bad.
I want to expand on that because I just have Frank. It'll be another episode if you guys are listening to this one. And he was, working in Dubai and Singapore, and he was looking at research around which city to put money in and do developments. And he explained the fact that in New Zealand, the red tapes are almost virtually none compared to other countries. And secondly, there was a lot of favorable economic factors, and it was a country that that a lot of people still want to just immigrate to. And I think when we're just in the market ourselves and we don't really look externally, we don't know how good we have it. It's such a attractive proposition to actually move to New Zealand. And I think it aligns with sort of what Matt is saying, like if you look at the long-term prospect is that New Zealand is still a high demand country for immigrants.
Yeah. It's a safe place that is a beautiful natural environment, and it has clean air. If you've ever been overseas and seen the air environments like China and some of the Southeast Asian countries, that the air is nowhere near as good here. And the political environments over there are different. The people feel fearful of their governments and they want to leave. They want to come here. So ironically, Kiwis hate it here. They're all off to Australia at the moment, but that's just a cycle thing,
It is. And I guess I always talk to people like migrants like myself. Hey, why would you choose Australia or why would you choose New Zealand? Usually if they're scared of spider and snakes and hot weather, then they'll choose New Zealand. That's usually the reasoning. It's not about it's less about the money. It's about the weather.
You left out crocodiles and sharks and jellyfish and scorpions.
It's been incredibly enlightening for your insights around DTI and how that would shape our property strategies moving forward and sort of what your views are with the market moving forward.
So, Blandon, we're talking about the impact of these rules, and I don't think actually they're going to be that impactful. They're going to keep people on the fringes from investing. And actually, the people most affected on the fringes are actually people who are new entrants into the property market. And I think it's going to make it harder for them, which in many respects is socially regressive because the Kiwi dream and the Kiwi pathway has always been you buy a house, you enjoy house price inflation, go through multiple cycles of house price inflation, and eventually, you end up relatively wealthy through property ownership. All the baby boomers in New Zealand have enjoyed that. Gen X, which is my generation, next generation down, we've had multiple cycles of house price inflation. But you're going to start later now because of these rules, because your income doesn't come until your late 20s, early 30s for many households. So that's going to be a generational thing, and it's tough on the new people coming through unless they've got rich parents who can support them into the housing. So in that regard, it's quite socially regressive, these rules.
That's awesome. Matt, it's been incredibly insightful to get your take on DTI and sort of how that shapes up property strategies. And before we wrap up today, I wanted to get a teaser from you because we're going to be talking about property tax in our next episode. And so for our listeners out there, give us a high level of, what's with property tax that investors need to know, and how is that going to impact them?
Right. Well, short story, the adults are back in charge. The absolute lunacy of the Labor government denying interest deductibility, that is gone. We've got short bright line periods. So I think we're going to see a bunch of houses dumped on the market from 1 July 2024 with a 2-year bright line period. So that might have a short-term impact. There's already a overhang of too much housing supply at the moment. Immigration's pushing people out of the country. Interest rates are high. It's all against property right now. So you look at that and say, well, bright line rules will allow you to sell after 1 July 2024. And that's going to be an opportunity for many to unlock equity that would otherwise have been locked up for 5 or 10 years under old rules. So how you make sure that you don't get caught with the old rules versus the new rules is something you need to be thinking about. What is happening with interest deductibility is something you need to be thinking about. The Airbnb rules with GST, they've changed, annoyingly, quite frankly. You need to be aware of that and how to get around that stuff. But I would say, Blandon, to be honest, with the Nats and Act in charge, and I can't say enough about David Seymour. He really did pull National to the right and save investors there. He was the one that was pro interest deductibility, and he got us a more aggressive, faster introduction of the rules. With all of that good work that's gone on, the rationalisation of the tax system for property investors is returning to New Zealand. We've just got to wait.
A lot of positive things coming.
Thank you again. When I talk to you next week, I'm going to talk to you about with the trust tax rate changing to 39% from 1 April 2024. I'm going to talk to your investors about how you can retain your income at a lower tax rate and reinvest in your portfolio and use the government's money effectively, the tax deferral that comes from it, to invest into your own portfolio. And that's a really important structure that we're using with our clients.
So in short, Matt's going to give you insights on how you're going to save a ton of money, make a ton of money, and do well in properties. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, listeners. And I'm your host, Blandon, signing out. And thank you again, Matt, for sharing your insights today.
And Blandon, thank you for having us here. If you'd like to get in touch with GRA, www.gra.co.nz. And thanks.
You don't even need www anymore, Matt. Just gra.co.nz.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.